Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs, Tess Lazaro, here from the Department of Foreign Affairs, so that she can help me answer some of the questions. Let's go straight to the questions. Specifically, what do you want to ask? Well, the Secretary can speak about the details of that, but as you know, the Philippines has proposed different methods for resolving the issues. We have, as we've always said, reiterated today that we want to have a rules-based approach to it, a legal approach. We have a proposal for a zone of peace, freedom, and cooperation, which we are talking to the other ASEAN countries about. We're still in the process of talking to them about that, so there's nothing conclusive as of yet with regard to that. We were told yesterday about that increase in troops with Australia, so I can't comment on the specifics of that. I'm not familiar with it. But if you're asking me in general how I view the increasing engagement of the U.S. In Australia and in the region, we view the presence of the Americans here, the renewed engagement of the United States here as ultimately a stabilizing force, and we welcome that. We welcome the increased engagement of the United States in the region. There's no discussion on our part, no in-depth discussion on our part at this point about joining the TPP. The Philippines-United States Partnership for Growth is mostly something between the two of us, and the idea is to promote what we call inclusive growth. That's something at this point we view separately from the TPP. Not at the moment.
Okay.
I think what it does, and given the defense relationship that we have, I think it bolsters our ability to assert our sovereignty over certain areas, yes.
As far as Myanmar is concerned, the Philippines supported its hosting in 2014, and I think this has been decided upon by the ministers. Thank you. Okay, as far as I think the process is concerned, yes, it will be recommended to the leaders. I can't comment on that. Perhaps you can ask the authorities themselves, U.S. delegation. Thank you. The Philippines supports the membership. Are you talking about the membership of Timor-Leste in ASEAN? Yes.
Let me address a couple of issues there. First of all, the reason why she was not allowed to travel was first that she is facing investigation on a number of criminal cases. And under Philippine legal procedure, if you're facing investigation, you need to seek permission before you leave the country. So we've applied a statute that has been in force for many years, and we applied it in this case as well. In the case of, specifically the case of President Arroyo, she said that she wanted to travel abroad in order to seek medical attention. There was a medical abstract, there were discussions with medical experts, and the Secretary of Health, who was a medical doctor, also conducted an examination of Mrs. Arroyo, and it was determined that the kind of treatment that she was seeking could be had in the Philippines, and therefore there was no need for her to leave. The TRO, the temporary restraining order, which was issued by the Supreme Court on the day that she was supposed to leave, was actually not served at the Department of Justice. What happened was that the spokesman of the Supreme Court held a press conference, much like this, where he announced that there would be a temporary restraining order. But I don't want to get too much into the technicalities, but the order itself was never served on that day on the Department of Justice. So we could not implement the court order based on a press conference. We needed to have the formal serving of that order, and that's what led to the situation the other day. We believe that it is important for this issue to be taken up at the EAS. This is not an issue that can be isolated between China and the Philippines. This is an issue that involves many countries in the region. And the more we're able to discuss this in an atmosphere of candor, I think brings us closer to ultimately finding some kind of solution to the problem. It's better that we're talking about it than that we're not talking about it, in our view. Well, we believe that they're here, and the United States has said that it has an interest here in East Asia, and we're all here anyway, so I think it would be a proper time for us to be discussing these issues. We're still working on that, to be honest with you. There are varying degrees of enthusiasm for it, as you probably know, and that just tells us that we need to work on discussing this more with the other countries in ASEAN. It's still a work in progress. That the ASEAN will become some sort of battlefield between the greater powers,
or that it will lose its authority to adjudicate in such matter in disputes such as the South China Sea.
That ASEAN would lose the authority? No, I think many of the claimants are ASEAN countries, so you can't remove ASEAN from the equation. So I don't exactly share the view. Also, ASEAN is not adjudicating any of these issues. There's no adjudication process that's being undertaken in ASEAN for the South China Sea issue. As I said yesterday, the president was attending to a domestic matter, which led him to delay his arrival by about almost a day. The president arrived at about noon today, and he is presently engaged in the ASEAN Leaders Retreat. He will be here for the duration of the summit and all the other meetings that were scheduled. So I don't believe that that's an issue anymore. The other question about, sorry, the other one was about the United Nations. Yeah, well, we've always said that the issue of the territorial issues should be resolved through the rule of law, and one of those laws is the law of the seas. So bringing the issue before the UNCLOS has always been an option for us. Well, ASEAN works by consensus, so it's, I mean, we're trying to get a position that what we call is based on ASEAN centrality. I would not necessarily say that we're using a position of ASEAN centrality to go against China. I think in general, countries in ASEAN want to use ASEAN centrality as a means of dealing with regional issues in general. So I would not characterize it as pushing against China specifically. We have an interest here. Some of the other countries in ASEAN have an interest. They have common interests, and we believe that if we speak with as much as possible a common voice, then that voice will be stronger. So it's simply that.
On the Myanmar question, there has been some encouraging signs since when Myanmar has released a good number, actually a substantial number of political prisoners, and with all the developments evolving in Myanmar, this has been a very positive indication. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I am not aware of the specifics of the initiatives for connectivity. That's being handled on the Department of Transportation level. So I'm not sure if Secretary Rojas is here, but I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you any specific answer on that. I'm not as familiar as I'd like to be on the specifics of that. I don't buy the talk that there's a rift. ASEAN countries have different perspectives on different issues at different times, and that's always been the way it is, but there's always discussion about it. There are many issues where positions are not exactly the same between countries in ASEAN, so I wouldn't characterize it as a growing rift, not at all. I think ultimately a greater U.S. engagement in the region will lead to more stability. Yes, I do. I'm sorry, I don't have any details on that. We have in the past done peso-denominated global bonds. I wouldn't be surprised if we did it again. I'm not sure exactly what the specifics are of this latest plan. The Secretary of Finance is actually here, and I can ask him for more details about that, but that's all I can tell you right now. Well, I don't think all the constitutionalists will have that same view. I think what you're seeing is a typical situation where you have a legal question and you have 5 lawyers and you have maybe 6 opinions. So we don't expect the legal community to agree all the time on the minutia of the interpretation of these laws. So I think there's some pretty healthy debate going on about the legal implications of all of these actions that are being undertaken. But obviously our position is not that. First of all, as I said yesterday, we were never served the TRO. It was a press conference and we didn't get served the TRO. I don't think that anybody would want us to take action based on legal action without being served properly the order. Number two, if you look at the dissenting opinions of Justice Sereno and Justice Carpio, normally when there's an application for a TRO, the court will ask for both sides to say, to explain. Normally, what we asked for was 5 days. We were asked for oral arguments, which is normal process of the courts. Those of you who have been following legal stories will know that when there's a petition for something like this before the Supreme Court, it is proper SOP, standard operating procedure, for them to get both sides. In this particular case, there was no hearing, there was no side, there was never an opportunity for us to explain. The TRO was simply handed down in violation of their own process. So I think that we're on pretty solid ground. I will leave that to the Justice Department. As far as I understand, everybody is waiting for the Supreme Court to make a ruling, and I don't think anybody I don't think that she should take any action until the courts have had a chance to talk about this. And I understand there is an on-bank scheduled for tomorrow.
You're referring to former President Arroyo.
What we raised was migrant workers' protection. I have the comments here. What we want to see, as you know, we have about 8.6, depending on who you're talking to, 8.6 to 10 million Filipinos living and working overseas. So the issue of migrant worker protection is very important for the Philippines. ASEAN is moving on a number of fronts to put in place protocols, procedures for better protection of migrant workers. And so the Philippines lent its voice, its support for ASEAN to move in that direction. I want to note also that President Yudhoyono, Indonesia, also has a large number of overseas workers. That position was also supported by President Yudhoyono. And I would believe most of the countries that had large migrant populations would feel the same way. One of the things, and this is just, I don't know what this is worth to you, but one of the things that I personally noticed, because there was talk about ASEAN connectivity, there was talk about West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, all of that. We've heard that before in other ASEAN plenaries. What struck me as a little different was the number of countries who mentioned the importance of inclusive growth. What they did was, most of them would talk about the context of what's happening in the world today. I think Prime Minister Najib of Malaysia said it very dramatically. He said, if you look at what's happening in the world today with the economies in Europe and America and the problems that is creating, both politically and economically, there seems to be a greater need, at least on the part of ASEAN leaders, to emphasize inclusive growth. Now, that's always been something that countries like Laos and the Philippines have talked about, but it was interesting to note that almost all the leaders said something about having to promote inclusive growth. That to me was something a little new. What I noticed at this morning's plenary session, there was much more emphasis on that, coming from countries who normally did not really pay that much attention to that kind of issue.
Could you also update us on the progress regarding the ASEAN Regional Economic Framework? I understand that 6 dialogue partners are going to be invited.
Sorry, Jonah, there was no discussion about that at this morning's plenary. Let me read to you exactly what we said about it. The Philippines underscores the importance of a peaceful resolution of the disputes in the South China Sea by applying the rule of law, specifically UNCLOS, utilizing a multilateral approach and adhering to the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. That's a general position that I think most of the countries in ASEAN well, some of the countries in ASEAN have had. My understanding is if you look at some of the political problems that have arisen in countries where you're seeing a lot of this economic, a lot of these economic problems, one of the things that people seem to be complaining about in many countries has been the unevenness of economic growth, the unevenness of opportunity. To some extent, what happened in the Middle East and North Africa was a reaction to that. When you have people in New York and different parts of America, the Occupy Wall Street people, they're talking about uneven growth. So what I think we've seen here in ASEAN, and this is sort of the context in which I believe the leaders were talking about it, was uneven growth ultimately can lead to political instability. And if you want to grow the economy and at the same time keep your political situation stable, the benefits of growth must be felt by a wider percentage of the population. And I think that's where we're all on the same page when we were discussing, when we were making references to equitable growth.
Well, first of all, as I said, the process is that the ministers will recommend this to the leaders. So again, it's up to the leaders to make that decision. About that this question was raised about the reaction of the U.S. I think we cannot comment on that. Well, we just leave it at that. Thank you.